Good evening and welcome to Brookline Booksmith's Author Event Series. My name is Alex Schaffner and I'm the events director here at the store. On behalf of all of us here, I'd like to say thank you for spending your evening with us, supporting both a wonderful author and your local independent bookstore. It's my complete honor to be chatting tonight with Justin Cronin about his new novel, The Ferryman. Before we get going, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, if you have not picked up a pre-order or else purchased a book and you would like to do so, you can do that at the end of the event, right back here at the counter. At the end of the Q&A, we'll be having a live signing. I believe any book can be signed, but probably this should be by Justin Cronin. And we'll just line up along this bookcase and head towards the middle of the store there, just to keep things kind of orderly. Yes, so now I'm pleased to welcome tonight's guest author, Justin Cronin. Justin is the New York Times bestselling author of The Passage, The 12, The City of Mirrors, The Summer Guest, and Marion O'Neill. His work has been published in over 45 languages and sold more than 3 million copies worldwide. Honors for his writing include a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and a Whiting Writers Award. A writer in residence at Rice University, he divides his time between Houston and Cape Cod. The Ferryman is a hefty book at almost 550 pages. I also tore through it in about 2 days. This exceptionally paced novel combines the eeriness of a world that's too perfect, the murmurs of revolution, the possibilities of humanity's future, and the best and worst impulses of our kind. It takes place in a place called Prospera, an island country that is purportedly the last habitable place on Earth, a place of ideal weather, satisfactory lives, and the ability to retire and be born into a fresh new life whenever you feel that you're wearing out in the current one. It's a book of secrets, and whether you see them coming or not, you'll be racing through the pages to reach the reveals. This is a great book, and I'm excited to discuss it, so please, everyone, welcome Justin Cronin.
That's like the best introduction anybody's done.
I'm sure that's not true.
No, it's excellent. No, it's wonderful, because now I don't really have to talk about the book.
I'm going to make you talk about the book anyway.
Nice, yeah.
You just wait.
Okay. I like to start by just reading one little passage, just to kind of like get the voice of the book out there so you know kind of how it feels. And it feels like an acid trip a lot of the time. Somebody said to me today on Twitter, they said, I'm about to get to the section called the nursery. And I tweeted back, dude, it's about to go bonkers, because it is, right? And it was kind of one of my goals writing the book was to just kind of go bananas. So she just described the world of the book. The Ferryman is the job of my main character, whose name is Proctor Bennett. And Proctor Bennett's job is to, he's like one part lawyer, one part cop, and one part psychotherapist. His job is for people when they are going to go to a neighboring island to be reiterated, that is to say, to acquire a fresh new life. His job is to kind of get them on the ferry, right? And he's sort of a bureaucrat. It's a government job, but it requires a great deal of sensitivity. He describes his job as providing grease to the gears of one of life's most emotionally complicated moments, right? Because when you go to the nursery and then come back freshly iterated, you have no memory of your previous life, right? You are really just wiping the slate clean, and some people kind of resist this idea, although most people, as he says, come around to see the idea of change as valuable. Now, Proctor is happy in his life, but he's also got some problems, psychological problems. And chief among these is he's doing something Prosperans do not do, which is that he is dreaming. Prosperans do not dream. The general theory is that life is so good, why would you bother? Right? Why would you bother? But Proctor has been dreaming his whole life. And these dreams feel to him like clues, right? Like clues, like a doorway into some other truth about the world in which he lives. So I'm just going to read this little section from the first part of the book, which is called The Last Beautiful Day, right? And it's just a couple pages long, and it gives you a sense of this guy and his voice and his mind. The dream was always the same. I am swimming in the sea. Below the surface, breath held, I push my way forward through a liquid blue-green world. My limbs feel clean and strong, my strokes effortlessly powerful. Sunlight shimmers on the surface far above. On a trail of exhaled bubbles, I ascend. The sun is setting, making ribbons of color against a purpling dome of sky. Drawn by an unknown influence, my actions are neither voluntary nor involuntary, they simply are. I swim away from shore. Night falls slowly, then all at once, whereupon I experience a terrible sense of error. This is all a grand mistake. I pivot toward shore to find no lights anywhere. The land has disappeared. I spin wildly in the water, all sense of direction obliterated. I am alone in an infinite sea. You don't have to be afraid, Proctor. A woman is swimming next to me with a smooth breaststroke, her head held erect above the surface like a seal's. I cannot make out her face. Her voice isn't one I know. Yet there is something about her presence that fills me with a great calm. It is as if I have been waiting for her. At last, she is here. It won't be long now, she says. I'll show you the way. Where are we going? But she doesn't answer. As she glides away, I follow. There is no wind, no current. The surface of the sea is as motionless as stone, the only sound, the gentle swish of water passing through our cupped hands. She gestures skyward. Can you see it? She says. A single brilliant star has appeared. It is different from the others, brighter, more distinct, with a bluish tint. Do you remember the star, Proctor? Do I? My thoughts are diffuse, drifting like chips of straw in a current. They skip from point to point. The ocean, its impersonal, inky vastness, the star piercing the sky like a beacon, all is known and unknown, all familiar, all strange. You're cold, she says. I am. My limbs tremble, my teeth are chattering. She moves beside me. Take my hand, she says. I have, it appears, already done so. Her skin is warm. It seems to pulsate with life. It is a rich sensation, powerful as a tide. It flows through my body in a wave of softness, a feeling of homecoming, of home. Are you ready? She asks me. She pivots toward me. For a moment, her face is revealed, but the image is too quick, unable to be retained, and then she is kissing me, pressing her mouth to mine. A torrent of sensation barrels through me. It is as if my mind and body have suddenly been linked to infinite forces. I think, this is how it feels to love. How have we forgotten how to love? The woman's arms have coiled around me, pinning my hands to my chest. Simultaneously, I become aware that the character of the water is altering. It is becoming less dense. She says, time to wake up, Proctor. I wave my legs frantically to hold myself afloat, but this is useless. It is as if I'm kicking air. I am held fast, barely able to move. The sea is dissolving, opening like a maw. Terror squeezes my throat. I cannot cry out. Look down, she says. I do, and with that, I plunge. We plunge down into an infinite black abyss, and the last thing I think is this: the sea is full of stars.
When you read the book, it hits different. So welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thanks.
How has it been so far to have the passage out? The Ferryman out?
The passage
You probably
is
know,
out.
like it's doing okay. We've heard that it's done
fine.
okay.
Yeah.
The Ferryman, how's it been to have this out in the world?
Well, it's good. This was a tough book to write. It took me a very long time. After I finished the passage, I was sort of empty for a while, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And this book, the book that you are reading, assuming you're reading it, and I hope you do, because each copy sold buys my son 4 minutes of college. 4.
I hear you.
Yeah. God, where was I? The draft you're reading is draft 17. Draft 17, before I went to copy editing and then to top editing. I turned it in to my editor saying B17 on it. And that's because of the fact that this is a book that is supposed to, about 3/4 of the way through, blow your mind, right? It's what I call a holy shit book.
I actually have some Goodreads reviews that speak to this.
Yeah.
I'd love to share them.
Please, go ahead, yeah.
Just a couple of quotes. First, after you finish Justin Cronin's books, you feel like your brain cells have run a marathon and each of them is out of usage. Second, this book goes right off the rails. The twists in this book are beyond what I could have imagined. I'm still not sure I understood some of it. Just when I thought I had things figured out, I was wrong in bold. And finally, you might be thinking that this whole plot summary sounds wild, and you would be correct.
Yeah, well, no, it was very hard to write, because when you write a book like that, you're constantly having to calibrate everything to make sure it adds up exactly to the twist, in this case twists, and there's a big one, that you want it to work. And this is what I call a holy shit novel. I want to just, every time I write a book, I want to do something different, kind of at the level of narrative trickery, narrative artistry. And what I decided I wanted to do is I wanted to write a book where about 3/4 of the way through the book, something happens that makes you say, holy shit, and throw it across the room with pleasure, presumably, because all of a sudden everything you thought you knew about the book turns out to be wrong, and not just wrong, but kind of perfectly wrong. Like, you look back down the hallway of the novel and you realize, oh my God, I was headed here all along. This is the answer, but I never saw it coming, right? I never saw it coming. And so, in a sense, you read the book twice by reading it once. You read it through once, and then all of a sudden something happens, and you kind of have to look back over and go like, wait, oh yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. My model for this, by the way, is the last 2 minutes of Planet of the Apes. The original Planet of the Apes. There was a time in America where it's possible to see the original Planet of the Apes and not know how it ended. And that was me, probably in about 1974, watching it on my parents' little black and white television the size of a periscope. And you come to the end, you got that final scene. I mean, if you haven't seen Planet of the Apes by now, don't know how it ended, sorry, but, it's been made into a million memes, Charlton Heston, comes off the horse, you're seeing him from behind, you don't see what he's seeing yet. It's the Statue of Liberty, he's been on Earth the whole time. And in 1970, whatever, my brain exploded in the little case of bone that I carry it in. And I thought that was just the coolest thing ever, because of course that's the answer. And I never saw it coming, but of course. And I wanted to do that with this book, hence 17 drafts. Yeah.
What does that editorial process actually look like? What are you technically doing when you're layering in those secrets?
Yeah.
And also, I think, because the other crucial part, of course, is that you don't want to give anything away too soon.
Right. It's very careful work. You have to. It's kind of perfect misdirection. The best kind of metaphor for it would be, the magician who's making you look at this while he pulls the rabbit out of his vest. It's like, it has to be perfect misdirection all the time, taking people here, maybe that's what how about, no, yeah. It's sort of like constantly kind of messing with their heads while simultaneously keeping them interested and engaged in the project, not just of following these characters on their various journeys and paying attention to things like the fact that this is an environment in which a revolution is cooking and all that other stuff. But simultaneously, you have to keep them engaged in the project of trying to figure this out in the same way that you would in a detective novel, which was also Planet of the Apes, one model. Detective fiction is the other one, because Proctor ends up behaving very much like a detective, trying to unravel what's happening publicly and then privately between his ears. And so that was kind of the model for how you do it, Murder on the Orient Express. It was everybody, right? Loved that novel when I was a kid. But that's kind of part of the way you tell a story like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two things that work really well in this book, one is, of course, that you need to suspend that mystery. And the other is, of course, that you have a lot to tell and you need to keep people turning pages.
Right.
And that's something that you do really effectively in this book. As I said, I looked at this, I said, yes, I will moderate this event.
Very thick book.
But no, it goes very, very quickly. And I'm wondering if you are conscious of what you do in a book that gives it that fast pace, because you can read a 100-page book that takes 3 times as long.
Right. Well, this is going to sound kind of nerdy and professorial, but that's my other job. And some of that has to do with the way the sentences behave. When my wife finally read the book, she says nothing gets in your way. right? And I read a lot of books that get in my way. Like there'll be a sentence that is just kind of awful or unnecessary. It's sort of clumsy. It's, you know, like very technical stuff. Like if its breath units are too long. I won't go into all that sort of stuff, but you have to write like sentences that move, you know, very cleanly forward in a book like this. And that's one of the things that happens when you do 17 drafts. Like there are no, I like knocked off every single verb, right? And by the time I gave it to my editor, she didn't have a lot to do. I mean, we both agreed one section of the book was too long, and that's because I was really anxious about some of the like the clues, right? I was like trying to. Here's the best piece of editorial advice I ever got. I was constantly like super aware in a paranoid way of plot holes, right? I always try to make sure everything, like I filled all the plot holes. And there was one I kind of just couldn't fill, and I was spending months trying to like figure out how to handle it. And my editor just said to me, "Justin, who cares?" Right? And I realized I was probably the only person who did. Because one of the things, of course, is that if you write a book that has a lot of momentum, you know, people, they won't catch it. And in all the Goodreads reviews, and I do pay attention to those because I think that's actually meaningful criticism. What happens to like just readers when they read a book, not, you know, a book reviewer who brings all kinds of weird baggage to it, to be honest. I don't review books anymore, I just won't do it. And because a book's really hard to write, and who am I to say good, bad, whatever, you know, I just don't like it. But the term that's never been used is plot hole in every single like review that I've ever read of the book. So my editor was not wrong.
So Proctor is the main character,
Yeah.
but there are other point of view characters in this book, and a lot of really good point of view characters in this book. And I wonder if you could talk about a few of the cast that we will meet.
Sure. The novel, of course, is also, you know, it's a novel that, you know, addresses some kind of large, like theological questions in some ways. You know, it kind of reaches out to like answer, you know, address some really cosmic matters. But along the way, as I said, it's a novel about you know, a sort of society built on the haves and the have-nots and that particular dynamic. And you know, this wonderful world of Prospera where people live in great luxury, live very long lives, and are always encouraged to pursue personal excellence, right? And everything's kind of curated. It's sort of like Northern California on steroids, right? It's like a lot of hot yoga, right? And there's plenty of money to go around. They have a system where basically whenever anybody dies, if they don't have an existing spouse, the money goes back into the central bank and is redistributed. So it's like, it's kind of like rich people's socialism, right? But you know, if somebody's drinking the wine, somebody has to pour the wine, somebody has to harvest the grapes. So there is an underclass that is, you know, a large group of people who live on an adjacent island called the Annex, and these are the support staff. Men and women of lesser biological and social endowments who nevertheless are, in my experience, wholly pleasant to be around. So says Proctor, okay? People are completely oblivious to these people's lives, but they essentially lived in a walled ghetto, right? And within their confines, a revolutionary movement is brewing, right? And it's called arrivalism because like a lot of revolutionary movements, you know, you can look at the civil rights movement in the 60s, for instance, which kind of originated in churches in a lot of ways. It's a mixture of a kind of religious, a sort of growing religious movement and also a political movement at the same time. And some of, you know, many of the other characters are kind of positioned around the novel to draw you into this dynamic, right? There's a woman named Thea who is an art dealer, right? Who is, you know, the other major character. She's like number 2, right? And she is somebody like Proctor for whom the world has always seemed dead. She's an art dealer, and all the art is bad, right? All the art is bad. And they actually kind of, their connection begins when they both have to flee a concert that is proficient but has no life, right? And so, you know, the people of Prospera they live a resistance-free existence. There's like nothing, no sorrow, no pain, nothing. Marriages are all done by contract, right? From 5 to 15 years. Well, I was investigating one question, which is if they say that the first person to live 150 years has already been born, right? And human life expectancy is reaching out. My kids' life expectancy, I mean, I'm going to tap out somewhere south of 80 according to the actuarial tables. I was born in 1962. The meter is running. But for my kids, it's probably 100. And in the not too distant future, we'll probably get to 120, not quite as standard, but as something that can indeed happen fairly routinely. If you were going to live that long, would you want to spend 100 years with the same person? Okay, think about it. You're 25, you're in love, and you're like, let's sign on for 100 years. Holy crap, no way, right? It just would defy all sense. And most of our social institutions, from our social welfare system, Social Security, and all those things, everything is based on data that's already out of date, which is that we're all going to check out before 70. And so I had to kind of reimagine a world like that. And so Proctor and Thea kind of connect over this terrible concert. There are other people. There's a man named Poppy, who is kind of a religious visionary. He's sort of the core of the revivalist movement. And then there's the political leadership class. And we have a couple characters from the political leadership class. Because Prospera is among it, it's a propaganda state and also a police state. It's just really comfortable for the people at the top, right? So they have no reason to question it.
Yeah, actually, I want to touch on that. Curiosity and the lack of it in the Prosperans. I think that is such an interesting and consistent thing. They show a lack of curiosity about their own government structure, about the people of the annex, and even about what it is that means that they can't leave their island. There's this notion that this is all that's left of the world, but at no point do they say what happened to the outside world or why they feel that way.
Right. I mean, they've essentially been bribed with luxury. Right, they've been bribed with luxury. And one of the things I wanted to get at was something that is, kind of keeps me up at night, which is the degree to which, capital and political power continue to flow upward into a very narrow bandwidth. And this is a story that historically has never ended differently. There is only one way it ever ends. And this worries me a lot because, among other things, pretty much every problem we have right now is actually solvable, including climate change. Right? We have all the technologies. We could solve pretty much everything if we wanted to. So why the hell don't we? And the answer is because the people at the top, right, have no incentive to actually do that. I live in a city, Houston, Texas, a fine town, many fine people. I've been there 20 years. I have great affection for it. But the petroleum industry is not one that is in a hot hurry to do anything, right, on behalf of the common good. And the one thing that started perplexing me early on when I moved to Houston, I moved into this very suburban neighborhood that was like something out of the 1950s. And it was a battalion of moms who ran the elementary school. It was a great school, that's why we picked it. And every morning the dads would get in their car to drive off and extract the riches of the earth. Everybody was in oil and gas. They were oil and gas lawyers, they were oil and gas engineers. And they're serving, I put gas in my car too. I don't own an electric car yet. But they were doing something that was directly imperiling their own kids, right, to some extent. And I was kind of marveling at this. I'm like, you do this every day, and you're cooking the planet like peas in a microwave, and it's not your planet, it's your kids' planet, right? So I lived in this little bubble that was consecrated entirely to the welfare of children, right? The good schools, the soccer leagues, the moms handing out juices at the basketball game, everything, right? And yet, the whole thing relied upon money from oil and gas. And this paradox, I couldn't figure it out, except that their lives were comfortable. They weren't going to change them. They had no incentive to do so. Right? It was bewildering to me.
Yeah, a sort of a staunch refusal to look at anything outside your direction,
right,
like the 3 feet around you.
When life is good, you don't look up.
Yeah.
It's very hard to make yourself do that. Very, very hard.
Well, in a bit of a change of direction, I want to note that this book is a little bit different from virus-induced vampire zombies.
Right.
And it's also very different, obviously, from your earlier books, which
right,
are a little more like on the realism side.
Right.
So I am curious, not about how they're different. I'm actually curious in how you feel that all of your books
Right.
are connected.
Well, first of all, one of the things I discovered when I sat down to write the passage, I'd written 2 books that I'm proud of them. They're for sale. They're substantially quieter. I was younger when I wrote them. There they are. When I sat down to write the passage, what I decided, sure, I'm gonna, the more I was a writer, the more I realized I was somebody who needed a lot of space. Like I needed 50 pages just to clear my throat. And so all the economies that I've been educated in, because I apprenticed to the short story, which is what people tend to do when they, for instance, go to graduate school to get an MFA, which I did.
You went to the Iowa Writers?
I went to Iowa, yeah, in sort of the heydays of minimalism, which can you imagine, like, if you know my work, you know how anathema that is to me, right? But I just followed the herd, and the short story as a literary form is what I would rather be locked in the trunk of a car with a weasel in the hot sun than write a short story, okay? Like, it is so hard to write a good short story. Almost all of them are like A+ or Fs. Like, it's just so hard. Everything has to be related to everything else. There's no room for tangents. I love a tangent. I love I've never met a secondary character I didn't want to marry, right? I just I give everybody
5 to
backstory.
15 years.
Yeah. So, one of the things I discovered when I sat down to write the passage is I was allowing myself to kind of make soup with everything in the kitchen. It was like, I'm just going to do everything in this, right? I'm going to have 2 runaway trains, But you write how you write. And so what happened was my sort of at the level of writing a sentence, but also in my sense of what a character is and what you do with a character, how important they are. How do you make it? I don't remember who said this. Somebody described a good literary character as a warm new being. I always thought that was wonderful, a warm new being. So I just try to make warm new beings, and then I put them in these bonkers situations, because one of the things I discovered is that, I've written novels in which, they were sort of novels of ordinary life for the most part, but if you make all your characters run for their lives at every moment, they cannot help but be themselves. Right? All the bullshit goes away, and you get to the core of people very, very quickly and very efficiently, and the stakes just, the energy and the stakes and the text just go up. So, I think what unites all my books is my interest in the perennial human virtues. I always say that if you're going to write about the end of the world, that's actually not the story you should tell. You should tell a story about what's worth saving and why we're savable and what is savable about us. And anybody who reads my fiction know I'm a parent. That's the one thing that's kind of deeply embedded in all of these, both the pleasures and the paranoias and the raw terror of being a parent. And that's, I think that's the most essential bond there is, because your kids are your immortality. There is no other one. They are going to live in the future you will not live to see, and then their kids and their kids and their kids and so on. And so that's, I'd say, the core of all of it. People who read the passage know that it's really about a band of people who make a family. They form a family. And this book, which I can't completely go into, right, is that's very much at the core of this, including some of my parental nightmares.
Yeah, parenting is very, very critical to this book.
In a world where people kind of don't have kids.
Yes.
Right? Because what happens is when you're reiterated, you come back as like a 16-year-old, right? A little bit empty-headed, you could do pre-algebraic arithmetic, you can tie your shoes, you can maybe operate a phone, but you have no one to call, right? And you're just a brand new person in the world, and so the ultimate luxury is not having children. Right? If you really want to have a padded existence, don't have them, right? Because the minute you have kids, the world can hurt you in ways that you just never knew was possible, right? And so they get these, fresh-faced 16-year-olds, they go off to something called the Academy of Early Learning. And they ascend very quickly, they figure out the world very fast, so these parents kind of get all the bona fides. Because it's very hard to live your best life when you're driving Timmy to, soccer and, trying to get takeout at 7 o'clock at night and one kid vomits, right? It's just, and these people are supposed to live their best lives, right?
Well, something that I think you touched on a little bit, and that I want to go deeper into is that you write these visions of the future, and parts of these visions are terrifying.
Right.
But I think that there is sort of an integral hopefulness
Right.
to the way you write. So I would love to hear you talk about sort of why hopefulness drives the novels, and what it means to you, and why it's important to put that into books.
Well, I am something of a catastrophist. COVID was right in my wheelhouse. Okay, right. I was just like ready for action, right? Completely. I was a general in my household. My wife had just broken her foot too, so she was complete. We all got COVID right away because she went to an emergency room the day of the lockdown with a broken foot in beautiful Wareham, Massachusetts, and everybody was coughing. And I was like, honey, you did not choose the right day. Thanks so much. But I grew up very much, I was born during the Cuban Missile Crisis, not like during the Cold War, but actually during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous 3 weeks in the history of the planet and the human species. And so I've been kind of obsessed with the possibilities of disaster my whole life, and as a young person, as a reader, gravitated towards literature that would help me kind of like work through some of these feelings. I mean, one of the things I read was The Effects of Nuclear War, prepared for the Senate Intelligence Committee. Like, I mean, I read all of it. That's not a good book, okay? Right? You can still find it on eBay if you're curious. But I read all the novels, and there were kind of two things. One is, I think that they appealed to me because I was such a socially unsuccessful boy, and being able to amuse yourself seemed like a very good post-catastrophe skill, But almost all these books are about survivors. They're about the people who have the will and the sort of moral sensibilities and physical capabilities and so on to survive. There are almost no totally hopeless novels of this kind. The only one I can think of, there's actually two texts that actually moved the meter on public thinking about the Cold War and nuclear holocaust, and one was On the Beach, which if you haven't read it, go read it, but it is the only book on this subject in which exactly 0 people survive, right? And it's all set in Melbourne, Australia. When I was there on book tour, it was a very important book. Like, it changed people's thinking about this. This made Duck and Cover look like nonsense. And I was in Melbourne, and I said, listen, this is a very important book for me. I'm sure I'd like to visit some of the places in Melbourne that was used in the novel, and nobody knew about it. I was kind of like, they're like, we're happy people, we're Australians, we don't want to think about that. Another one was a television movie in the 80s, Day After. Even the President of the United States watched it, and that we'd come to a second kind of critical moment in the 80s, and that helped us back away from that moment. But with the exception of these two that I can name, almost all of them have a kind of, they are endorsements and explorations of human resilience. And so I go back to these stories again and again as a kind of comfort. And I think that's why everybody reads them, because when you watch The Walking Dead, you don't see yourself as one of the zombies. You see yourself as one of Rick's crew, getting through the day, right? You don't see yourself as no, you're one of those people, right? And so when you read these things, you're always in the position of the survivor, just kind of automatically, right? That's the narrative position that you're put in.
Well, pretty soon we're going to turn this over to the audience. I'm sure that you have questions. But I think people often like to know if, when they are done with this book, they can look forward to anything more.
No, I'm done. No, you can't have a 4-book contract. I've started the next book, which is going to be a little bit different. I'm actually going to try to write a short book. Like, that's my technical challenge this time, not to need, because the first draft of this is about 700 pages, which was the shortest book I've written in a very long time. Like, the Passage was 1,300 manuscript pages. I took the Passage trilogy, and when it was all over and had been published and the dust had settled, I went and I took the final drafts of each book, the ones I had sent to my editors, and printed them up and put them in a pile, and it was this tall. 10 years. So yeah, I'm working on another book. I'm also involved right now in a way that is completely unofficial at this point in working on maybe a television adaptation of this novel.
Oh, this would be great TV.
I think it would, yeah. And so that's been kind of interesting. It's taken a lot of time away from the other work, and I'm kind of ready to go back to the other work. I do just see myself principally as a novelist. That's, if I end up doing that kind of work, it'd be for variety, but it's a side dish. It's not the main course. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for whatever happens next, and I would love to take some questions from the audience. Who would like to ask one?
Sir?
Very excited to read this book. I love the Passage trilogy.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think do really, really well in those three books, and I'm expecting the same out of this one, is the literary way you treat your characters, you create your characters, you write characters, and the genre of the situation. You alluded to some a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Is your process to kind of come up with a situation and populate it, or do you come up with characters and then put them, how do you...
It's simultaneous. Like, I cannot imagine a story without people in it, because, people are the story. People are the story. The situation of this book emerged actually after I had imagined some early stuff that made me curious. Like, this book actually came from a kind of strange moment, which was that right after I finished the passage and I was kind of waiting for the next thing to do, and I had a list of ideas that I kind of accumulated over time, but none of them seemed, that I didn't connect to any of them anymore. They were just there. They felt inert. You should always write the book that's asking you to write it, and none of them at that point was asking. And I was taking a walk down on the Cape, and on a starry night in like late fall, so very clear, lots of stars, lovely new moon. Houston has no stars of any kind. It's daylight 24 hours a day. And a word dropped into my head, which is, I can't explain this, but it was the word Oranios, which I did not know what that word was. Oranios, it's actually a proper noun. It's a variation on the god Uranos, the father of the Titans, father of the heavens. And then in the novel, that's the magic word, right? Proctor Bennett hears this word, right? Giving away a little bit, but he hears this word, and when you hear this word, you are trouble and you are in trouble, right? And it's the kind of key that unlocks, it starts the book, sort of sends him on his journey. And at the same time, I imagined a scene that, for those of you who read the novel, know is kind of the first major, it's the first sort of like inciting event, which is, I imagined, for no reason whatsoever, an old man on a pier having a psychological meltdown. And so those two things kind of arrived in my head simultaneously, and something was going on. I just didn't know what. It took me a long time to kind of figure out how this was, where it was taking me. And a lot of other things had to snap in place. But I always think of characters and situations as simultaneous. I mean, one of the difficulties I have when I go on the road, for instance, to talk about a book, and I'm doing it in the media or I'm doing it in front of an audience, is I always have a hard time saying what my book is about. This is the question I hate the most, to be perfectly honest, because you can just describe a situation, but that's not really the story. The story is what happens to this guy and the people around him, right? Situations are, you said, apocalyptic vampire trilogy. I never thought of it that way. Like, it was not how I thought of it. I actually thought of the passage as a Western. No, I did. It's about people who've been living they've been living in isolation, encountering for the first time the sort of majesty, beauty, and danger of the West. It's a road novel, and the literary antecedent for the passage is the novel Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. Does the name Lonesome Dove ring a bell with anybody in this room? Thank you. Yes, for those of you who follow me on social, right? Yeah. That very important book for me, and now Lonesome Dove the dog, some of you have heard. She does all my PR for me. And the vet bill for that dog, after my wife scooped her off the highway, was about the same as like a late model, low mileage Toyota Camry. So, I'm not kidding. And so I figured she should chip in, and be a help. So she handles all my PR now.
I think that's very interesting. I'll get back to you guys, don't worry. I think that's very interesting because one thing that I found really fascinating about this book is how many genres you managed to fit into it.
Right.
And I really like what you said about it being a mystery novel.
Right.
But then it's a mystery novel that navigates through science fictions.
Right.
So that's really fascinating. And I think what you're saying makes sense if you're thinking also of like, if you think of like Seven Samurai becomes
Right.
Magnificent Seven, it's the same thing where
Sure.
like the structure and the heart of the story is carrying through, even though
Right.
the trappings are different.
When we talk about genre, we're actually talking about two different things.
Yeah.
And one is world genre, which is basically where on the shelf it goes, right? Is this a mystery novel? Is this a fantasy novel? Is this science fiction? And then there's plot genre, which is, you know, what is the basic mechanism by which the story is told, you know, and the Passage is a road novel, and The 12 is a spy novel, and City of Mirrors is a war novel, and with Brideshead Revisited tucked inside it. Seriously, right? That's, you know, the whole Fanning era, that's basically what it is. That was the model. I always I loved that novel. I loved the BBC show, which we all had in the 80s. And for this one, you know, you could generally shelve it as science fiction just based on what it says on the flap, right? But it's a detective novel, first of all, and then it does break into some science fiction mechanisms and plot stuff. I grew up on a steady diet of sci-fi. That was kind of what was available for young men then, actually, because YA as a genre hadn't been invented in 1972. Like, there were a few gems out there like Wrinkle in Time and some books like that. But you went basically from juvies straight to adult books. And science fiction was kind of the pathway that a lot of young readers took. And it was the only thing for boys, oddly enough. And so I read it all, you know, Arthur Clarke, all the sort of golden age of sci-fi stuff. And it's my literary foundation. I love that stuff. You know, the first time I really understood a book at the level of more than just plot was reading the Martian Chronicles, right? You know, the last moment of the Martian Chronicles, like, I was like, wow, irony, got it, right? You know? Yeah, I like to work with multiple genres all the time, but I also like to work with different plot genres as the plot requires. When I teach a class of novel writing to undergraduates that are all writing their first novels, it's a gas. I love to do it. And we always start with Gatsby just as like the foundational text, because it's the most symmetrical novel ever written. Like, all of its parts, all of its devices are paced like literally perfect, right to the page in terms of parts and so on. It's amazing. And so throughout the semester, we'll talk about literary devices in terms of Gatsby. Like, oh, that's an owl-eyed man right there, you know? And what genre does Gatsby belong to? And the answer is simple: My Crazy Summer. That's a genre, My Crazy Summer, right? And so, you know, you can think of novels in lots of different ways in terms of groups like that. So we always say, like, literary commercial. Okay, that's a sort of rough division, but everybody, you know, literary and commercial is the funniest division in the world, because, you know, commercial novels are literary novels are books written to be respected, and commercial novels are books written to be read, right? And the tragedy is, generally speaking, for most books, neither thing happens. And every literary writer wants to sell books, and every commercial writer wants respect. So, you know, a lot of these are just false dichotomies.
I'm wondering, your novels there's a lot going on.
Right.
Do you construct this story, an outline the whole story before you start writing, or does it?
Yeah, I do that less and less. I did it for The Passage. The first volume of The Passage, I did that. And then volumes 2 and 3, I had sort of summaries of them, and I knew basically where the whole thing was going, and I knew what the final moment of the third book was. I needed, like, to plant a flag way down the road so that every choice I made was on behalf of getting there. And that, because every time you write a sentence in a novel, you have an infinite number of sentences you can write, and you need something that whittles that down just a little bit. This book I had to do more feelingly, and which was part of the reason it took so long, and I'm going to try to be more disciplined about the next one, right? To be honest, like, I should have planned this one a little bit. I would have probably been done at about draft 11. Right. But I feel like you do need, I mean, I knew how this one ended. That I always had. And I mean the last sentence. Like, I need to know what the language is of the terminal moment of the story, because the book is made of words. Like, that's, you know, like knowing the kind of thing it is helpful, but knowing the language is what really gets you there. So I always knew that part of it. And I knew the major sort of turning points, and I knew the places the book had to go. You have to go to the nursery, right? You have to see what the hell goes on there, because nobody knows. It's an implied promise of the book, right? Arrivalism, you have to figure out why these people are suddenly believing in something, right? So there are things that any situation makes promises that you better fill. You better come up with the goods. And so I knew what those were too. Yeah.
You mentioned TV adaptation before, and I'm just wondering how you might describe your experience with the TV adaptation of the passage.
Well, it was going to be renewed. I mean, it was going to be, we had the numbers for the renewal, but then it was the Disney-Fox merger, which was basically Disney taking over. We had already reserved, when we say we, I actually mean they. I had nothing to do with the actual, people say like, what was your contribution? And the answer is I wrote the book, right? Because of the way the deal had been structured, because it had originally been purchased for the movies, I had no say. I was a co-producer, which is a way of saying somebody who goes on press junkets. But the show had the ratings, but then the new guy, head of programming, came in from Disney after Soundstage Space had been booked and everything, and killed every dramatic series at Fox and replaced them with his own, greenlit his own pilots. And so that's why I went away. My experience of it was being very much on the sidelines and thinking a lot of weird choices were made. A lot of weird choices. I was watching them make it, and it seemed kind of arbitrary a lot of the time what they were doing. And they stumbled into material they actually didn't have rights to. They didn't have rights to the second and the third book, and they just wandered into it and started using it. I'm like, it's gonna cost you some money. That was the upside of their weird, arbitrary process.
I just want to say I listened to the audiobook versions of The Passage, and I just want to say you did a really good job, and I can't wait to listen to this book when it
My audio narrator is a guy named Scott Britt, who's sort of an audiobook celebrity. I mean, people buy books that he narrates because he narrates them. And when it came time to do this book, I was like, Scott, I only want Scott, nobody else. And they said, fine. And I said, but I also need a second narrator for those third-person sections you mentioned. And those mostly focus on female characters. There's two male characters that get a little space, but it's almost entirely women. And so I said, let's get a female audiobook narrator, audiobook actor for that. And they said, great, we'll send you some audition tapes. And so they sent me, 10 or 12. And one woman just nailed it. I thought she was great. Her name was Suzanne Ferryman. And I said, that's what I want. I want her. And she said, they said, oh, that's very convenient. She and Scott are married. That worked out very well. I just got to do an interesting event in Phoenix. They live in LA, like most people in that biz. That stuff all happens in LA. It happens kind of in the acting community, not in the publishing community. And they came over from LA to my event, and I did it with them, and they did the reading. They did a fairly long reading, and they're so good at it. And so when I just read that, I had actually vowed never to do that again after hearing Scott and Suzanne do it. But they're lovely. I've known Scott for years. He's a very lovely fellow.
Let's do two more. Anybody? All right, if we don't have any more questions, then we will say thank you.
No, you're very
so
welcome.
much.
Thank you all for coming out. It's nice to be back in Massachusetts. I texted my wife when I was picking up my rental car. I'm going down to the Cape after this to go cut the grass, actually, which is like this tall apparently. And I texted my wife and I said, two people have been spectacularly rude to me in the last 30 minutes. It feels so good. Those are my people. Yeah.
How many times did you get cut off?
Oh, like every time. Like, I mean, like,